When Jasmine Crockett defended a war hero falsely accused of fraud, Judge Whitmore cut her off and declared, "I am the law in this courtroom." But just 5 minutes later, she exposed a $2 million judicial bribery scheme, and the courtroom watched him spiral into panic. Live. What did she reveal that turned the judge from untouchable to undone? Stay with us. This is a story worth every second of your time. Jasmine Crockett walked into the federal courthouse like a blade slicing through fog. Sharp, steady, unflinching. Once a rising federal prosecutor, she had turned her back on the government's power to become something far more dangerous. A civil rights lawyer who didn't flinch when the system came for her clients. Today, she stood for Maxwell Sterling, a decorated black veteran accused of misusing charitable funds. A man whose only real crime seemed to be helping too many people without asking permission. The media painted him as a fraud. Jasmine saw through it. The charges were thin, but the courtroom was thick with bias. Presiding over the case was Judge Harold Whitmore, a man known for cold formality and rulings that mysteriously always seemed to fall hardest on minorities. On paper, he was impartial. In practice, his gavel had silenced too many voices like Sterling's. The courtroom was already hostile before a word had been spoken. Jasmine could feel it. The sideways glances, the quiet scoffs, the weight of assumptions pressing down like iron. But she wasn't here to play defense. She was here to expose the truth. And if Whitmore thought he could bully her into silence, he just made the biggest mistake of his career. The moment Jasmine opened her briefcase, the attack began, not with fists, but with interruptions sharp enough to cut steel. "Objection! Irrelevant," Judge Whitmore barked before she'd finished her first sentence. She tried to introduce documented financial statements from Sterling's foundation, but he waved them off with a dismissive scoff. "We're not here for charity storytelling, Ms. Crockett," he sneered. "Stick to the facts, if you have any." His voice carried a smug certainty, the kind honed over years of unchecked power. Every time she spoke, he cut her off. Every motion she filed was denied within seconds, without review. The courtroom wasn't a chamber of justice. It was a rigged arena, and Whitmore held the sword and scales alike. Jasmine stood her ground, but the message was clear. This wasn't about law. It was about shutting her down. Then came the moment he made it personal. "Frankly, Ms. Crockett," he said, leaning forward with a smirk, "I'm surprised you're even licensed to practice in this court." Gasps rippled across the room. "You strike me more as an activist than a real attorney. Politics wrapped in a pantsuit." His words dripped with contempt, designed not to argue her case, but to undermine her very presence. Jasmine didn't flinch, but inside she knew. This wasn't just about Sterling. It was about her skin, her gender, her history, and a system that hated being challenged by someone who looked like her. Still, her voice never cracked. She picked up the stack of evidence again, eyes locked on Whitmore. "Then let's talk about the fact," she said, "unless, of course, they scare you." But Jasmine didn't take the bait. She didn't raise her voice or flinch under the judge's glare. Instead, she did something far more dangerous. She started telling the truth anyway. With the same composure she used in front of grand juries and TV cameras, she laid a folder on the podium, opened it with quiet intent, and pulled out the first document. "This," she said firmly, "is a record of every financial transaction made by Sterling's foundation in the last 2 years, audited, verified, and submitted through proper channels." Whitmore didn't look at it. He didn't have to. The panic wasn't in the paperwork, it was in what came next. Jasmine reached for another folder, thinner but heavier in implication. "And this," she continued, "is where your courtroom begins to feel less like a place of justice and more like the end point of a very dirty trail." Inside that folder were internal emails from the Liberty Justice Fund, a shadowy PAC disguised as a legal advocacy nonprofit. The headers bore the names of lobbyists, donors, and most notably, an assistant in Whitmore's chambers. "Here's a conversation," Jasmine said, her voice tightening like a noose, "discussing how cases like Sterling's should be fast-tracked for conviction, preferably under judges deemed reliably sympathetic to our goals." She read the line verbatim, each word sharper than the last. Reliable, sympathetic, strategic. No one in the courtroom moved. No one breathed. She placed the email on the evidence table with surgical precision. These aren't just bad faith whispers, Your Honor. They're operational tactics, and your name appears twice in the coordination chain. Her eyes didn't leave his face. So before you lecture me on courtroom experience, maybe you should explain why a judge sworn to be impartial is corresponding with political operatives behind closed doors. Whitmore's face twitched. Barely, but Jasmine saw it. The defense table leaned in. The prosecution froze, unsure of what to say or do. The clerk stared wide-eyed, her pen hovering in midair, and yet Jasmine's voice never wavered. My client is not the criminal here, she said. He didn't set up back-channel communications with power brokers. He didn't engineer courtroom outcomes through financial influence. But someone did. She opened another email, this one mentioning a pending case involving a high-visibility defendant with military ties, and recommending a swift, discouraging ruling to send a message. Jasmine didn't add commentary. She didn't need to. The words were enough. The message wasn't just being sent anymore. It was being exposed in real time, under oath, in front of everyone. And for the first time all morning, Judge Whitmore had nothing to say. And just when the courtroom thought Jasmine Crockett had played her final card, she opened a new folder, this one thinner, sleeker, and more lethal than anything that had come before it. Her voice didn't rise, it didn't need to. It had the sharp, deliberate weight of a scalpel slicing through layers of pretense. There's one more thread I'd like to follow, she said, flipping to the first page. Because influence doesn't just vanish, it leaves a trail. She paused, letting the silence build, then lifted a printed wire record. This is a financial transfer dated May 12th. $125,000 from a Liberty Justice Fund holding account to a consulting firm registered under the name Ashcroft Strategies. She turned to the jury and held it up. The registered owner of that firm? Evelyn Whitmore, Your Honor's wife. A thunderclap couldn't have shattered the room more than those 5 words. Jurors stiffened. The prosecution turned pale. Even the bailiff, stone-faced for the last 2 hours, blinked. Judge Whitmore didn't speak, but the flush rising across his neck said everything. Jasmine didn't slow. She laid down a second transfer. Here's another. Dated August 6th. Same source, same recipient. This time, $140,000. She flipped to a timeline she'd created. Simple, clear, damning. Each of these transactions coincides within 48 hours of critical decisions you handed down in this very case. Denials of defense motions, suppression of evidence, and even Mr. Sterling's bail refusal. Her words were like hammer blows, measured, heavy, impossible to ignore. And Ashcroft Strategies, she continued, has no public website, no payroll filings, no contracts. It exists only on paper, and only as a funnel. The judge leaned forward slightly, his lips parting, but no words came. Jasmine pressed on, her tone unwavering. Now I understand that spouses are entitled to private business interests, she said. But when those businesses receive 6-figure deposits from political entities connected to your courtroom, and you consistently issue rulings that benefit those same interests, it is no longer private. It is deeply, publicly relevant. She turned to the gallery. If a defense attorney made these payments, they'd already be in handcuffs. She pointed directly at the bench. So why is a judge's wife allowed to collect them in silence? Her finger dropped. The silence didn't. Judge Whitmore finally spoke, but his voice cracked. Ms. Crockett, I am warning you. Jasmine met his glare without blinking. What are you warning me against, Your Honor? Presenting evidence? Asking questions? Naming what everyone in this room is now thinking? She took a slow breath. I'm not accusing, I'm exposing. The numbers don't lie. The timestamps don't lie. The beneficiary of the money is your household, and the decisions benefiting those donors were yours. She stepped forward slightly, calm but relentless. So the real question isn't whether Ashcroft Strategies exists. It's how long you thought no one would trace the money back to this courtroom. Everything inside Judge Whitmore snapped. His composure, his mask of control, the illusion of authority he had so carefully cultivated, all of it shattered in an instant. He didn't just raise his voice. He exploded, slamming both palms onto the bench with such force the microphones rattled, and the gavel flew off the platform. "Sit down," he bellowed, the veins in his neck bulging with rage, his face a deep, blotchy red. The courtroom jolted. One juror actually flinched. The clerk froze, eyes wide, halfway through typing the last statement. Whitmore wasn't issuing a ruling. He was screaming like a man cornered, exposed, humiliated. "You are in direct contempt of this court, Ms. Crockett. I will not allow you to continue this disgraceful charade." Jasmine didn't flinch. She stood exactly where she was, both hands lightly resting on the podium. Her breathing was steady. Her gaze was calm. But around her the air crackled with tension so thick it felt electric. Whitmore jabbed a finger toward her, the tip trembling. "I will have you removed. Do you hear me? Removed. Dragged out if I must. This is my courtroom." His voice broke on the last word, and that, more than anything, told the room what was really happening. This wasn't a judge defending justice. This was a man watching his throne crumble beneath him. The prosecutor remained frozen, unsure whether to intervene or hide. The court officers glanced at each other, hesitant, confused, caught between duty and truth. Still, Jasmine didn't move. She didn't shout. She didn't argue. Instead, she reached down, picked up the fallen gavel from where it had rolled under the table, and set it gently back on the bench, right in front of him. "Your Honor," she said, her voice even, unwavering. "When a courtroom stops listening to the truth and starts punishing the person who speaks it, it's no longer a courtroom. It's a stage. And right now, it's clear who's performing." A hush swept the room. No applause, no noise, just stunned, reverent silence, as if the whole courthouse had stopped breathing. Whitmore opened his mouth again, but nothing came out, because Jasmine hadn't just challenged him. She had stripped away his power, word by word, until all that remained was a man, a bench, and a truth he could no longer deny. The silence that followed Jasmine's calm defiance of the judge was so thick it felt like a held breath. And then, without raising her voice or seeking permission, she reached into her briefcase with the same precision she'd shown all trial long and pulled out a small black digital recorder. The room didn't know what to expect. Another document, another speech. But this was something different. This was a moment no one could talk over, no one could interrupt. "If my words aren't enough," Jasmine said, her tone cool but deliberate, "then let's listen to someone who had no idea the truth would ever be heard." She pressed play. Static crackled, brief and harsh, before giving way to a trembling voice. "I didn't want to do it. He said if I didn't change the transcript, I'd be finished, that my job wouldn't exist by Monday." A chill swept through the courtroom. The voice was unmistakable. The courtroom clerk. Judge Whitmore's own clerk. No one moved. No one dared to. The voice continued, measured, frightened, deeply human. "He told me to delete the section where the defense mentioned the financial records. Said it was irrelevant and would never make it into the final log anyway. I didn't know what else to do." Jasmine let the words play out, eyes fixed on the judge. He was frozen. His hand hovered inches from the bench, fingers stiff, lips drawn into a line so tight it looked painful. At the clerk's desk, the young woman in question sat completely still, her hands shaking, her eyes wide with something between panic and relief. She didn't deny it. She didn't even try. A single tear slid down her cheek, and in that small, raw detail, the entire room saw the truth of Jasmine's case. Undeniable, uncoached, unfiltered. Jasmine clicked the recorder off. The silence afterward was deeper than before. Now it was charged, electric, alive with shifting momentum. "This isn't speculation," she said clearly, her voice slicing through the stillness like a blade. "This is not an opinion. This is a young woman under oath, confessing that court records were altered at the direction of a sitting judge." She turned to face the jury. "And if the official court record, the very foundation of a fair trial, can be manipulated in secret, what hope does any defendant have in this room? What hope does justice have?" Her words didn't shout. They didn't need to. They cut deeper because they were quiet, controlled, measured, and undeniably true. The change was instant and visible. Jurors who had earlier glanced at Jasmine with polite skepticism now looked at her with something else entirely: shock, concern, respect. Several leaned forward, elbows on knees, eyes wide. One crossed his arms and stared hard at the judge, as if just realizing the man behind the robe might not be the symbol of fairness he'd once assumed. The gallery, once silent out of curiosity, now sat frozen in disbelief. Journalists' pens hung midair. Even the prosecution looked visibly shaken, unsure whether to object or sink through the floor. The silence after the audio ended felt like something sacred had just been broken. The kind of stillness that follows a truth so sharp it cuts through protocol, status, even fear. And then Judge Whitmore exploded, not with control, not with law, but with raw, naked panic. "That's a lie," he shouted, voice cracking under the strain. His chair scraped violently as he stood, towering behind the bench like a man trying to reclaim authority through sheer volume. "That recording is falsified, inadmissible, and completely fabricated." His hand slammed down, rattling papers and sending a pen flying off the bench. "Bailiff, officers, seize her, right now. I will not tolerate this circus in my courtroom." His finger jabbed toward Jasmine like a dagger, but his voice, once sharp with control, now rang hollow, frayed at the edges by desperation. "She's tampering with evidence. She's subverting the authority of this court. I demand her immediate arrest." But nothing happened. The officers posted along the wall didn't move. The bailiff, who had followed Whitmore's orders for years without question, stared at him, unmoving, his jaw tight, his eyes full of something dangerously close to doubt. His hand hovered near his holster, but never unlatched it. A second officer exchanged a glance with him, silent, tense. There was no confusion in their eyes, only the heavy weight of conscience. Jasmine remained motionless, framed by the bench's shadow and the light of truth. Her shoulders were back. Her face was unreadable. She didn't reach for anything. She didn't say a word, because she didn't need to. The courtroom had heard the clerk's voice. They had watched her tremble. They had felt the lie unravel right in front of them, and no amount of screaming could put it back together. Whitmore's voice climbed into hysteria. "Do your job. What are you waiting for? She is attacking the integrity of this court." But that word, integrity, landed with a thud. Even the jury flinched, like they couldn't decide whether to laugh or look away. The irony of a corrupt judge shouting about integrity was too loud to ignore. He stepped out from behind the bench now, pacing like a caged animal. "I will have you held in contempt. I will file misconduct charges. You will never practice law again." He spat, his words becoming less legal, more personal, more vicious. But still no one moved. No cuffs were pulled. No one advanced toward Jasmine. Instead, all eyes slowly began to shift. Away from Jasmine, toward him, toward the man unraveling under the weight of his own secrets, his own rage, his own crumbling facade. Power only works when people believe in it, and in that moment, no one believed in his anymore. Not the bailiff, not the jury, not even the clerk, who sat crying quietly behind her desk, her face buried in her hands. The gavel remained untouched. The law hadn't failed. The man entrusted with it had. And Jasmine, she stood like a monument to resistance in the middle of the chaos, silent, grounded, unbroken. Because for all his threats, he couldn't touch her anymore. The truth had already done what the system refused to. It held him accountable. And just as Judge Whitmore's fury reached its boiling point, as his voice cracked and the courtroom teetered between order and collapse, the double doors at the rear burst open with a sudden, unmistakable authority. The sound of polished shoes on marble echoed louder than his shouting ever could. 4 FBI agents in Navy windbreakers strode down the aisle with purpose. Not chaos, but certainty. One held a federal warrant, the gold seal unmistakable in the fluorescent light. "This courtroom is now under federal jurisdiction," the lead agent announced, his voice cold and official. "We are executing a judicial misconduct investigation effective immediately." The gallery gasped. The judge froze mid-rant, his mouth half open, fury dissolving into disbelief. "You can't do this. I'm a federal judge," he barked, voice now thin, cracking, almost childlike. But no one flinched. Authority had just changed hands, and the room knew it. Agents fanned out with silent efficiency. Two approached the bench and collected the stack of documents Jasmine had introduced. Another moved to the clerk's desk and secured the official transcript logs. The lead agent stepped directly in front of Whitmore and said with deliberate calm, "Judge Harold Whitmore, you are under federal investigation for evidence suppression, obstruction of justice, and conspiracy to commit judicial fraud." The words hit the room like a tremor. Whitmore stumbled back a step, his hands lifting slightly, as if realizing too late that robes don't grant immunity. "This is political. This is a setup," he muttered, voice cracking. But his words held no weight anymore. He was no longer the voice of power. He was the subject of it. The agents turned him around, cuffed him without fanfare, and walked him past the very people he once silenced. The jury, the reporters, the veterans, the victims. All watched him go with wide, stunned eyes. Jasmine didn't move. She didn't celebrate. She just stood quietly, watching it happen with the calm of someone who had seen power abuse itself for too long. As Whitmore was led through the courtroom doors, the silence was heavier than applause could ever be. Jasmine finally stepped forward, not to take a bow, but to speak truth. Her voice wasn't loud, but it carried. "I didn't stand up to win," she said. "I stood up so that justice wouldn't be forgotten." Her words weren't for the cameras or the courtroom. They were for everyone who had ever been told to sit down, to be quiet, to let it go. And in that moment, with the judge gone and the truth laid bare, Jasmine Crockett didn't just win a case. She reclaimed a courtroom and everything it was supposed to stand for. The day after Judge Whitmore was removed from the bench, the courtroom felt different, not quieter, but heavier, like the walls themselves were still echoing with the truth. With the FBI now in possession of the original court records, audio files, and a full confession from the clerk, there was no longer any fog clouding the facts. Justice, long buried beneath layers of bias and bureaucracy, was finally surfacing. Jasmine stood beside Maxwell Sterling as a new judge, neutral, restrained, and free of political ties, took the bench. The jury, instructed to disregard all previous rulings tainted by Whitmore's misconduct, had reviewed the evidence again. This time, without interference, without lies, without fear. It took them less than an hour. When they returned, the courtroom held its breath. Maxwell stood, hands folded in front of him, wearing the same suit he had worn on the day of his arrest. Except this time, he wasn't bowed. He stood tall, like the soldier he was. The foreman cleared his throat and in a steady voice said, "We, the jury, find the defendant not guilty on all counts." The room didn't erupt. There were no cheers, just a moment of stillness so pure it felt holy. Then Maxwell's knees buckled slightly and Jasmine reached out instinctively, steadying him with one hand on his back. His mouth opened, but no words came. Just a slow, tearful exhale. The sound of a man finally released from the weight of being wrongly accused. Jasmine didn't speak. She didn't need to. She'd said everything she came to say through the evidence, the truth, and her refusal to be silenced. Maxwell turned to her, voice barely above a whisper. "Thank you," he said, eyes full. She nodded just once. That was enough. But outside the courtroom, the verdict moved like wildfire. Within hours, headlines swept across the country. Veteran vindicated. Judge removed in courtroom power scandal. Civil rights attorney exposes judicial corruption. And at the center of every story was the truth the system had tried to bury. Veterans groups began demanding reviews of cases involving politically motivated charges. Civil liberties organizations launched petitions. Federal watchdogs received thousands of public records requests. The footage of Whitmore's meltdown and arrest became the opening montage for documentaries, podcasts, editorials. This wasn't just a verdict. It was a spark, a rupture in the wall of untouchable authority that had protected people like Whitmore for decades. People who had never met Jasmine sent letters, some from prison, some from courtrooms still fighting, others from their kitchen tables saying thank you, not for the drama, but for the proof that one person, armed with truth, could stand in front of the machine and make it stop. Jasmine didn't celebrate. She didn't take interviews. When asked what victory felt like, she simply said, "It's not victory, it's restoration of a man's name, of the law's meaning, of something we should never have had to fight for in the first place." And as the country watched, inspired, outraged, awakening, one truth became clear. The case of United States versus Maxwell Sterling didn't just clear an innocent man's name. It forced an entire system to look in the mirror. In the weeks that followed Maxwell Sterling's acquittal, something began to stir far beyond the walls of the courthouse. The story that had ignited headlines was no longer just about one corrupt judge or one brave attorney. It had become something else, something deeper, a reckoning. The face of Harold Whitmore, once a symbol of control, now filled screens across the country as the emblem of everything that had gone wrong in the justice system. His image flashed across news tickers while pundits debated the scale of his misconduct. But what no one expected, what no one could have prepared for, was what came next. One by one, voices began to rise. Not politicians, not celebrities, ordinary people. People who had once sat in Whitmore's courtroom, just like Maxwell Sterling, but who never got their vindication. A single mother named Lila James was the first. She stood on the steps of a courthouse with a printed transcript in one hand and a photograph of her son in the other. Through tears, she told reporters how she had been convicted of welfare fraud after Whitmore denied the introduction of key financial evidence. "He told my lawyer it wasn't relevant," she said, her voice cracking, "that my story sounded rehearsed, but I was just trying to feed my son. That was my crime." Then came Andre Vega, a former police officer who had once worn his badge with pride, until he was charged with misconduct for breaking up an unlawful eviction in his own neighborhood. Whitmore refused to allow character witnesses to testify. Evidence that would have cleared him was ruled inflammatory. He lost his badge, his pension, his marriage. "I didn't even fight it," he said on national television, "because when Whitmore looked at me, I knew I'd already lost. I was guilty before I opened my mouth." And then came Malik Howard, a name Jasmine would never forget. A college student, bright and ambitious, who had come to her firm 2 years earlier, desperate for help after being convicted of assault during a student protest. His file was thin, the evidence murky, and at the time, Jasmine had made the hardest decision of her career. She'd turned him away. Not because she didn't believe him, but because she didn't think she could win. She remembered how he looked at her when she said the words, "Without something concrete, I can't take your case." Now watching him speak on the news, calm but haunted, something inside her twisted. "They said I was violent," Malik told the cameras, "but all I did was raise my voice. Whitmore called me a threat to stability and sentenced me to 18 months. I lost my scholarship. I lost everything. And no one believed me." Jasmine sat alone in her office that night, watching the interviews on a flickering laptop screen. Outside, the city buzzed with celebration, with chants of justice and banners demanding reform. But inside, she sat in silence, because she had missed them. Not because she hadn't tried, but because the system had taught her that some battles couldn't be fought without proof. And now she understood the truth. Proof had always existed. It had just been buried, suppressed, erased. She opened her drawer and pulled out an old box. Case files, rejected appeals. Notes scribbled in margins that read, "No admissible evidence," or "Judge ruled against motion." Most were dated over the past decade, and nearly all of them bore the same name at the top of the bench: Honorable Harold Whitmore. Page after page, face after face, story after story. It wasn't coincidence. It was a pattern. A system built to fail the same people, again and again. Cases she once thought were isolated, tragic misfires, now connected like pieces of a larger, darker puzzle, a network of control disguised as courtroom discretion. She stared at the name Malik Howard on the top of one folder. She had written "denied" in bold red ink across the cover, and now it felt like a scar. By morning, she had made her decision. At the next press briefing, with microphones swarming and reporters leaning in, Jasmine didn't talk about Sterling's case. She didn't celebrate. Instead, she opened a folder in front of her and said, This is the case of Lila James, a mother convicted without a voice. She opened another. This is Andre Vega, a man whose life was erased by the stroke of a biased pen. Another. This is Malik Howard. I turned him away once. I won't do it again. She looked into the cameras with a clarity that made the room go still. What happened in Whitmore's courtroom wasn't an exception. It was the system working exactly as it was designed to, until someone stopped it. I'm not here to reopen one case. I'm here to reopen every case that man touched, every conviction, every denial, every suppressed motion. And if there are others like him still out there, I'll find them too. The reaction was immediate. Civil rights lawyers from across the country began reaching out to her office. Law students offered to digitize case files. Investigative journalists started digging into Whitmore's donation records, his chamber's appointment history, even his personal investments. A grassroots coalition called Reopen the Docket exploded across social media, with thousands of users sharing old case numbers, verdicts, and personal stories once dismissed as irrelevant by the court. Inside the firm, Jasmine worked around the clock. She'd become the center of something far larger than herself, but she carried it with a quiet resolve. Gone was the cautious attorney who once weighed what could be won. Now she was chasing something that didn't fit inside a verdict or a news cycle. She was chasing restoration, not just for those who'd been silenced, but for the belief that justice, even broken, was still worth fighting for. And as the movement grew, something remarkable happened. The public began to listen not just to the stories, but to the patterns. The way evidence was repeatedly suppressed, the way bail was disproportionately denied, the rulings that always seemed to favor the powerful and punish the defenseless. People began to connect the dots, not just in Whitmore's courtroom, but in others across the country. Judges were re-examined, prosecutors questioned, past rulings refiled for appeal. For the first time in years, there was a sense that the machine had slowed, and maybe, just maybe, it could be rebuilt. But Jasmine never forgot the cost. She carried it in every file she reopened. In every apology she whispered to a client she once turned away. In every night she stayed late reading testimony that had never been heard because someone like Whitmore decided it didn't matter. And through it all, she didn't seek revenge. She didn't want fame. She wanted accountability. She wanted to prove that courage doesn't always look like shouting or standing in front of a camera. Sometimes it looks like going back to the places where you failed and standing there again until the job is finished. So when asked months later why she reopened so many cases, why she pushed so hard when no one would have blamed her for walking away after Sterling's win, she simply said, "Because justice isn't a headline, it's a promise, and I intend to keep it." And in those quiet moments, between headlines, between hearings, between one file and the next, Jasmine Crockett kept that promise, one name at a time. The deeper Jasmine went, the darker it became. Reopening old cases was just the beginning. Each file she pulled off the shelf felt like a thread, and the more she tugged, the more the seams of something far larger began to unravel. At first, it seemed like a pattern of isolated injustices, cases buried under red tape, evidence dismissed with alarming consistency, rulings that defied logic but aligned perfectly with political objectives. But the dates didn't lie. The rulings were too convenient, the timing too exact. It wasn't just about Whitmore anymore. It was about what and who was behind him. While sifting through sealed court memos and disbursement logs, Jasmine stumbled on something that didn't belong, a financial disclosure buried in a subpoenaed hard drive from Whitmore's former law clerk. It listed a series of public engagement disbursements totaling over $2 million, money traced not to Liberty Justice Fund, but to a seemingly unrelated nonprofit with a harmless-sounding name, Judicial Stability Initiative. On paper, it promoted confidence in the federal bench. But to Jasmine, the name felt too polished, too safe. She knew exactly what that meant, so she started digging. What she found wasn't just unsettling, it was chilling. Judicial Stability Initiative, JSI, wasn't a public watchdog or legal aid fund. It was a high-level lobbying entity backed by anonymous corporate donors and political operatives with ties to several high-profile PACs. Its operations were surgical. hidden, almost perfect. JSI funneled money through layers of intermediaries, philanthropic fronts, consulting contracts, silent partnerships. The paper trail was intentionally fragmented, but Jasmine had built her career connecting fragments. She cross-referenced grant cycles with judicial rulings in key states, swing states, battleground districts, regions where judges still held the power to tilt entire policy landscapes through subtle decisions. The pattern was undeniable, and at the center of it all, Whitmore. She found the contract late one night, buried in a scanned email attachment misfiled under a mislabeled folder. It was signed electronically, dated nearly 3 years before Sterling's case. A $2 million judicial research grant from JSI to Whitmore's Private Consulting LLC, an entity he never disclosed publicly, not even on his mandatory federal filings. The language of the contract was coded, vague, but one line stood out, highlighted in yellow by a whistleblower at the IRS. In exchange for administrative partnership and issue-aligned prioritization of judicial workload. Jasmine read the sentence again, then a third time. She knew what it meant. It was a bribe wearing a lab coat, legalese designed to mask its purpose. Judges weren't being paid to rule one way or another. They were being paid to shape the battlefield, to decide which cases made it to trial, which evidence got heard, which defendants were prioritized for harsh examples. It wasn't just corruption, it was systematic influence embedded in the very framework of American jurisprudence. She leaned back in her chair, stomach tight. This wasn't a rogue operation. This was a machine, and Whitmore had only been a gear in its engine. The deeper she went, the more disturbing it became. JSI had touched dozens of judges across multiple circuits, some retired, some still sitting. She found internal memos labeled phase implementation reports, listing metrics for behavioral consistency, media impact risk, and rule alignment scores. It wasn't just tracking judges' rulings, it was grading them, like employees meeting ideological quotas. Judges were rewarded for upholding certain mandatory minimums, dismissing specific civil cases, denying ballot-related claims, or suppressing voting rights appeals. The influence was tailored, quiet, and devastatingly effective. Jasmine's hands trembled as she printed the final page. A list of strategic judicial partners. 13 names. 9 still active on federal benches. 3 of them on the short list for appellate appointments. This wasn't just a backroom deal, it was a silent coup. And Jasmine was sitting on a bomb. But whistleblowing it wasn't enough. She knew the system would fight to bury it, deny it, call it conspiracy. So she built the case the only way she knew how. Brick by brick, fact by fact. She didn't release it to the media. Not yet. She brought it first to the Senate Judiciary Oversight Committee. The members listened, then fell silent. Some looked stunned, a few looked scared. They asked for copies. Jasmine gave them evidence. Not outrage. Timelines, memos, bank records, names. Within 48 hours, the investigation went federal. Agents raided JSI's headquarters in Virginia, an office building with no signage, staffed by interns who had no idea who they worked for. Servers were seized, executives subpoenaed, but the pushback came fast and brutal. One news outlet, clearly bought, accused Jasmine of fabricating influence claims to raise her political profile. Anonymous threats hit her inbox. Her office was hacked. Former clerks loyal to Whitmore published op-eds accusing her of weaponizing justice for personal gain. But the damage had already been done. The contract existed. The money existed. The pattern was irrefutable. And so were the people who had suffered because of it. Lila James, Andre Vega, Malik Howard, Maxwell Sterling. Their names weren't footnotes anymore. They were evidence. Evidence that behind the curtain of judicial robes and gavels, there were billionaires and power brokers pulling strings, treating justice like a chessboard. Jasmine didn't back down. She doubled security. She stopped going home. She slept on a couch in her office. Because if JSI had been willing to spend millions to buy control of the bench, they wouldn't hesitate to try and silence the one woman exposing them. But this time, she wasn't alone. FBI analysts confirmed over 20 transfers similar to Whitmore's. A leaked memo revealed that JSI had operational partnerships with policy think tanks and partisan lobbying groups dating back over a decade. Congressional hearings were scheduled. Former judges were called to testify. The nation wasn't just watching, it was learning. Learning that corruption didn't always wear a suit and tie and hand out envelopes in parking lots. Sometimes it wore a robe. Sometimes it signed a grant agreement. And yet through it all, Jasmine didn't falter. When asked by a reporter how it felt to discover such a vast network, she replied with the same steadiness that had carried her through the Sterling trial. I didn't go looking for this. I went looking for justice. But when you chase justice deep enough, you find out who's been running from it the longest. And now they weren't running anymore. They were being hunted by the law they once controlled. Because in exposing the Judicial Stability Initiative, Jasmine hadn't just uncovered corruption, she had dragged a hidden empire into the light, and the system would never be the same again. Even as federal agents tore through file servers and boardrooms in D.C., as subpoenas flew and politicians scrambled to claim distance from the scandal, Jasmine knew there were still pieces missing. Something deeper. The skeleton beneath the skin. The Judicial Stability Initiative had left behind a digital footprint. Yes, but most of their strategy had been whispered, implied, and spoken in rooms where recorders were banned and loyalty was purchased with silence. And in those rooms, there was always someone in the corner, typing quietly, unnoticed. So when her phone buzzed at 2:47 a.m. with a restricted number and the words, "It's me, I want to talk," alone, Jasmine knew exactly who it was. She didn't hesitate. The next evening, under flickering overhead lights in a parking garage 3 blocks from her office, Jasmine stood beneath concrete and shadow, waiting. No cameras, no press. Just her breath fogging the air and the echo of heels approaching from the far end of the level. The woman who emerged from the darkness wasn't the same courtroom clerk who had cried through testimony and collapsed into shame. She looked thinner now, paler, but something in her posture had shifted, no longer fearful, just exhausted, but ready. She clutched a small, silver external hard drive to her chest like it was radioactive. Her hands trembled as she handed it over. "Encrypted," she said quietly. "Passwords inside the envelope." Jasmine took it gently, as if holding the weight of history itself. For a long moment, neither spoke. Then Jasmine looked her in the eyes and asked the only question that mattered. "Why now?" The clerk swallowed hard. Her voice cracked, but her words were clear. "Because I used to believe the system would protect me until it forced me to lie for it." She looked away, blinking furiously. "They told me I was part of something bigger, that if I just did my job, if I kept things running smoothly, it would all be okay." But then the edits started, transcripts cut, evidence misfiled. Then came the memos. "I saw rulings planned out before hearings even started. I saw names, targets. They weren't defendants. They were political moves." Her voice hardened. "I thought I was helping justice move faster. Turns out I was helping it die quietly." Jasmine stood still, saying nothing, letting the silence settle between them like dust on the truth. The clerk stepped back, wrapped her coat tighter. "You need to be careful," she said. "If you go public with what's on that drive, they'll come after you. Not like Whitmore. Worse, these people don't lose quietly." Then she turned, walked back into the night, and vanished, leaving Jasmine alone in the silence, holding a drive that could shake the very foundation of the American judiciary. Back at her office, lights off, blinds drawn, Jasmine opened the envelope and typed the password. "Lady Justice, 2020. And the screen lit up with more than she was prepared for. Dozens of folders, time-stamped, organized, labeled not by case names but by themes. Priority narratives, Q2 strategy, case placement, veterans and minorities, target judges, appellate allies, outcome certainty, thresholds. Each one opened like a confession. Meeting transcripts with donors, audio clips from conference rooms where clerks, judges, and operatives discussed how to streamline the messaging through case law. One file, labeled simply Sterling, contained a full timeline of his arrest, the judicial schedule, and recommendations from the Liberty Justice Fund, sent weeks before his indictment. They'd selected him not because he'd broken any laws, but because he'd made headlines, because he'd embarrassed certain donors, and because he fit the narrative, a minority veteran who could be framed as corrupt to discredit broader reform efforts. Jasmine listened to a clip 3 times before she even moved. It was a male voice, confident, smooth, laughing slightly as he said, "If we can't rewrite the law, we control the rulings. The people won't notice. They'll think the court decided, and that's the genius of it." Her hands clenched into fists on the desk. She kept going. There were lists, cases recommended for dismissal, cases approved for harsh sentencing, judges ranked by ideological flexibility, payment schedules, bonuses, a whole subfolder titled Clerk Compliance Tactics, detailing exactly how young, overworked assistants were coached into silence, job security, recommendations, vague threats of irrelevance, and in the middle of it all, Whitmore, his initials, his edits, his voice in 3 separate clips, saying things like, "We can make this disappear," and "You want results? Keep the optics clean. We bury what doesn't serve the bench." Jasmine leaned back in her chair, heart pounding. She had uncovered the front, the public-facing arm of judicial manipulation. But this was the spine of the machine, the engine room, the rot, and one woman, broken by guilt, dragged through humiliation, had been brave enough to bring it to her. She called her team in at 4 a.m. No coffee, no breakfast, just laptops, headphones, and resolve. No one asked questions. They knew this wasn't about law anymore. It was about legacy, about whether the truth mattered more than power. 2 days later, Jasmine stood before a federal panel with a copy of the drive in her hand. "I am not here with allegations," she said. "I am here with receipts, audio, transcripts, contracts, the bones of a system built to look like justice and function like tyranny. The public trusts the courts because it has to, because without that trust, everything falls. These people have weaponized that trust and hidden behind your silence." She looked them all in the eyes. "But I won't be quiet, not anymore." The hearings went public. Headlines followed. Lawsuits were filed. Judges once considered untouchable were suddenly being reviewed, recused, replaced. But through it all, Jasmine kept her promise. She didn't name the clerk publicly. She shielded her, protected her. Because whistleblowers don't just expose corruption, they pay a price for doing so, and Jasmine knew that better than anyone. Weeks later, the clerk sent one final message. No subject line, no greeting, just one sentence. "Thank you for believing me when the system no longer did." And Jasmine stared at it for a long time, before closing her laptop and whispering to herself, "You saved more than just a courtroom. You helped tear down the walls." Because sometimes the most powerful testimony doesn't come from the stand. It comes from the shadows, from the people who've seen the worst of the system and choose to rise anyway. It had been exactly 1 year since the Sterling trial cracked the mask off a broken system. 1 year since Judge Whitmore had been led away in cuffs, and Jasmine Crockett had stood silent as the courtroom exhaled. But the ripples had never stopped. Investigations bloomed across districts, petitions reopened old cases. At least 7 federal judges had been recused, reassigned, or indicted. New oversight bodies had formed. Whistleblowers had surfaced in waves. But beneath the headlines and hearings, one truth had stayed with Jasmine. Corruption wasn't extraordinary. It was ordinary, systemic, predictable, allowed. So when she received the invitation from the National Judicial Academy, one of the highest institutions in the legal world, to deliver a keynote to their graduating class of judges, she hesitated. She wasn't interested in trophies. She wasn't interested in legacy, but she knew what was at stake if she stayed silent. And so, 12 months to the day after the verdict, Jasmine Crockett stood alone on a polished oak stage, the seal of the Academy behind her, facing rows of black robes and eager eyes. A room filled with rising judges, each one preparing to wield the gavel, to decide who walks free and who doesn't, to define what justice would mean. For decades, she didn't smile. She didn't begin with applause or anecdotes or gratitude. She began with fire. "I am not here to talk about winning," she said. Her voice was calm but filled the auditorium like a drumbeat. Because justice is not a contest. It's not a career. It's not a political tool. It is a responsibility. And if you're not ready to carry it with clean hands and a clear heart, then you should walk out of this room right now. A few heads shifted, one or two exchanged glances, but no one moved. Jasmine continued, her steps slow and deliberate across the stage. I've stood in courtrooms where the outcome was decided before the opening statement. I've watched judges dismiss evidence not because it lacked merit, but because it challenged power. I've seen victims turned into villains with a wave of a hand and a stroke of a pen. And I've watched the law become a weapon, not for justice, but for control. Her words cut the room open. She reached the podium and paused, letting the silence settle. Then she placed a file on the surface. Worn, thick, edges curled. She opened it and pulled out a single page. This is the case of a man named Maxwell Sterling, she said. You've probably read about him. Decorated veteran, accused of fraud, denied bail, nearly imprisoned for something he didn't do. But you didn't read the footnotes. You didn't see the judge who suppressed evidence because it didn't serve the narrative. You didn't hear the clerk who was told to clean the transcript or risk her career. You didn't watch an entire courtroom pretend that bias was order, that silence was professionalism, and that injustice, when executed politely, was still somehow legal. A hush fell over the room. No one shifted now. Every breath was quiet. Every gaze locked forward. Jasmine's voice dropped lower, more personal, more dangerous. I turned people away. I told them I couldn't help without evidence. And in doing so, I became part of the same system I thought I was fighting. Because injustice doesn't always look like a lie. Sometimes it looks like bureaucracy, like clean shoes and neutral tones in scheduled hearings. It wears a robe, and it asks you to trust it while it tears lives apart. Her hand gripped the edges of the podium, and I let it happen, until one day, I didn't. She let the weight of the moment breathe. Then she stepped away from the podium, looking each future judge in the eye. You're going to enter courtrooms where no one will challenge you, where your word will shape lives, where silence will surround your mistakes. And when that day comes, ask yourself this: are you protecting the law, or are you protecting yourself? Her voice rose, not in volume, but in strength. Because power will beg you to believe that justice must bend to politics, that speed is more important than truth, that the outcome must fit the narrative. And if you are not careful, if you are not brave, you will become what you once promised to stop. She paused, then held up a photo, black and white, folded, creased, of Malik Howard. This young man lost 2 years of his life because a judge didn't think his voice was worth hearing. That judge is no longer on the bench. But Malik still wakes up every day with the memory of cuffs on his wrists in a cell instead of a classroom. She placed the photo down gently. Your job is not to be efficient, it's to be just. The room was so silent it could have shattered. If you want the robe because it gives you control, because it gives you status, because it gives you the last word, take it off now. Burn it. Go home. We don't need more judges. We need more guardians. Her final words came slowly, each syllable deliberate. I did not stand in that courtroom to win. I stood there so that the next generation of judges would remember why the courtroom exists in the first place. It exists for the voiceless, for the vulnerable, for the forgotten. And if it ever becomes a stage for ego or a shield for the powerful, then it's no longer a courtroom. It's a weapon. She let the silence linger one last time, then stepped back, leaving only the echo of truth behind her. No applause followed, not at first. But then a slow, rising sound emerged. Not thunderous, not performative, just a quiet, growing wave of hands, clapping for something more than a speech, clapping for a reckoning. Because in that moment, in that room full of robes and ambition, Jasmine Crockett had done something that no verdict could ever guarantee. She reminded them all that justice is not a title, it's a choice, and one they would have to make every day for the rest of their lives. The speech ended, but its echoes didn't fade. The footage of Jasmine Crockett standing on that stage, unflinching, unapologetic, made its way through law schools faster than any textbook could. Within weeks, professors were requesting transcripts. Civil procedure classes dissected her courtroom strategies, while legal ethics seminars framed entire modules around the Sterling case. But it wasn't the scandal they focused on. It was the principle that justice isn't just a structure of statutes, but a fight for clarity in a world that profits from confusion. In one lecture hall at Georgetown, her cross-examination of Whitmore was projected on a screen 20 feet wide. A professor paused the video right as Jasmine held up the forged financial document and asked, "Now, what does this moment teach us about moral authority versus judicial authority?" In a packed room of future attorneys, no one spoke for a long time, because they weren't watching an argument. They were watching a rescue of truth from power. At Yale, her pretrial motion to introduce systemic bias was used in a moot court final. At Howard University, students held a week-long seminar titled The Crockett Doctrine, When Law Bows Speak Louder. Law journals debated the ruling. Podcasts broke down her questioning frame by frame. And perhaps most telling of all, a panel of retired judges updated the ethics curriculum with a new case study titled When the Bench Breaks, the United States versus Sterling and the Price of Silence. In a matter of months, her fight had become more than a trial. It had become a teaching tool. And Jasmine didn't even know the full extent. She wasn't reading headlines. She was still in the trenches, reopening files, mentoring public defenders, pushing for legislation to bar undisclosed financial influence in judicial appointments. The work hadn't stopped, but something had shifted. This time the system was listening. And while Jasmine's name rose across headlines, another name quietly returned to the spotlight. This time on his own terms. Maxwell Sterling. The man who once sat in court shackled in silence was now speaking before halls full of veterans, lawmakers, and financial oversight boards. Not as a defendant, not as a victim, but as an educator. After months of therapy, advocacy training, and legal debriefings, Sterling had chosen not to disappear after his acquittal. Instead, he chose to walk directly into the very structure that had tried to destroy him and rebuild it from the inside. His first stop was a regional summit for veterans advocacy, where he delivered a speech titled, "Numbers Don't Lie, but Judges Can." The audience, mostly retired service members, sat in stunned silence as Sterling laid out how easy it was for a decorated vet to become a legal scapegoat, and how organizations that claimed to help often funneled funds through opaque networks, leaving the most vulnerable behind. "I didn't just survive a courtroom," he said. "I survived a system that bet on me being quiet after they cleared my name. But I'm not quiet. Not anymore." From there, he was invited to join the National Coalition for Veteran Financial Literacy. But he didn't just sit on their board. He rewrote their entire intake process. Sterling introduced a vetting system for funding partners, enforced full transparency on donations, and created a module called Know Your Contracts, which taught young veterans how to read grant language for hidden clauses, especially the kind that once framed him. He worked directly with younger soldiers transitioning out of service, many of whom carried invisible scars: PTSD, dishonorable discharges, exploitative employment offers. Sterling sat with them, looked them in the eyes, and said, "They'll use your uniform when it's convenient. Then they'll hang you with the ribbon if they think no one's watching. Learn the system before it learns you." His words carried weight because they weren't theory. They were battle-tested truth. By year's end, Sterling had advised 3 nonprofits on internal financial ethics. 2 of them found inconsistencies they hadn't noticed before. One of them caught a 6-figure embezzlement scheme, not because of an audit, but because of a checklist Sterling helped write. His name now appeared not in case dockets, but in grant guideline manuals and ethics panels. He was no longer being judged. He was helping define the standards. Meanwhile, Jasmine and Sterling stayed in quiet contact. No fanfare, no photo ops. Just the occasional phone call, updates, insights, advice. In one of those conversations, Jasmine asked him how it felt now, standing in the middle of the same system that nearly erased him. "It's like walking through the ruins of a house that once burned you alive," he said, "except this time, you've got the hose." But perhaps his most important contribution came quietly, behind closed doors. when he co-authored a proposal for the Department of Veterans Affairs titled Structural Protections Against Targeted Prosecution. In it, he recommended a national database of judicial rulings that disproportionately affected veterans of color, a mechanism that could detect patterns long before another Sterling case was allowed to happen. And Jasmine? She wrote the legal appendix. She submitted the proposal herself. And for the first time, it passed committee without objection. Because the system had learned, slowly, painfully, but it had learned. One afternoon, nearly 18 months after the verdict, Jasmine sat in a lecture hall, not as a speaker, but in the back row, unannounced. A third-year law student was presenting a paper on courtroom ethics, and on the final slide, she saw something that made her throat tighten. A black and white photo of Sterling on the stand. Beside it, a quote, "If the system can break someone who served it, what do you think it'll do to the rest of us if we don't fight back?" Monsieur Sterling. And beneath that, one word in bold. Remember. Jasmine didn't speak to the student after class. She didn't need to, because the legacy was already working. The law had remembered, not just the scandal, but the humanity, the cost, the choice. And while names like Whitmore faded into footnotes and sentencing reports, the names that once trembled under cross-examination, Sterling, Howard, James, Vega, now lived in footnotes of a different kind. Course material, reform policy, public service training. Their stories weren't cautionary tales. They were calls to courage. And in the quiet that followed, Jasmine finally allowed herself to believe something she had never said out loud, not even in the moments of victory, that maybe, just maybe, justice had a memory after all. The real lesson buried beneath the trials, the headlines, and the shattered silence is this. Justice is not guaranteed. It is defended. Jasmine Crockett didn't fight for glory. She fought because someone had to say no when power demanded silence. Maxwell Sterling didn't survive because the system worked. He survived because someone finally chose to listen. The greatest injustice wasn't the charges, it was how easy it was to make them stick. It was how familiar the silence felt around a man society had decided not to believe. But they stood up, and in doing so they reminded the world that law is not a weapon, and courtrooms are not stages. They are sacred spaces, meant to serve the people, not control them. Jasmine didn't seek revenge. Sterling didn't seek pity. They sought accountability, and in that pursuit they gave others the courage to do the same. The lesson isn't about victory, it's about responsibility. To protect truth when it's inconvenient, to speak up when it's dangerous, and to remember that real justice begins when someone dares to say, "This is wrong, and I won't let it stand." Because silence protects power, but truth sets people free. A federal judge quietly blocked a major deportation. No hearing, no transparency. That secret ruling put national security at risk, until Congresswoman Jasmine Crockett blew the lid off everything. What did she find hidden behind the black robes? And why are judges across America now panicking? Stay with us. This is a story worth every second of your time. Jasmine Crockett wasn't the kind of politician who needed a spotlight to speak her mind. Her words carried weight, with or without a microphone. Before Congress, she was a courtroom warrior, sharp, relentless, and unafraid to stare power in the eye. On a rainy Tuesday night, while scrolling through her encrypted inbox, a flagged report caught her attention. It was brief but explosive. A deportation flight carrying over 20 Venezuelan nationals, several flagged as potential cartel affiliates, had been grounded at the last minute. No mechanical failure, no weather delays. Just a one-line federal order issued by Judge Malcolm Pierce. No hearing, no review, just a decision. Jasmine froze, eyes narrowing. She knew the playbook. "He didn't pause a policy," she muttered. "He rewrote it." She dove into the paper trail. There had been no transparency, no public statement. The Department of Homeland Security had been blindsided. Field agents left scrambling to explain the reversal to airport security. Crockett's instincts screamed. This wasn't compassion, it was overreach. Since when does a judge get to halt a national operation without even stepping into a courtroom? She asked her aide, voice laced with fire. No one answered. They knew better. She looked out the window toward the Capitol dome, lit like a watchtower in the storm. And then she said it, quiet but cutting. No one elected him to rewrite immigration policy. The storm didn't come from outside. It was in her hands, stapled, highlighted, and falling apart at the seams. Jasmine Crockett sat in her office, the blinds half closed against the dull gray of a Washington afternoon. Her desk was no longer a workspace. It was a battlefield covered in open files, government seals, and flagged documents. She was on her third cup of black coffee, sleeves pushed up, red pen clutched like a weapon. Her eyes moved fast, trained, deliberate. Every page she read made her colder, angrier, sharper. These weren't random mistakes. This wasn't bureaucratic clutter. This was precision neglect, dressed in legal decorum. She scratched a thick red line across a report labeled, "Low Priority Risk Released." The name belonged to a Venezuelan national with prior arrest records linked to armed gang activity. No trial, no further screening. Jasmine's brows tightened. Another page, an ice-field memo warning about missing biometric reviews. Deferred, it said in the margin. Deferred, but the flight had already been canceled. And the judge? No explanation, no hearing, not even a published opinion, just a sealed emergency order sent at midnight. "We're talking about 20 people," she muttered, "and no one thought the public deserved a reason?" Her team stood around her in tense silence. No one knew what to say. She didn't need encouragement. She needed answers. "Look at this," she said, slamming one sheet on the table. "They stopped a federal deportation process with an order based on partial data, not evidence, not testimony, just vibes and vague language." Her voice rose, not with panic, but clarity. "Where's the judicial restraint in that? Where's the due process for the rest of us?" She grabbed another file, circled phrases like expedited release and insufficient threat profile, then looked her assistant dead in the eye. This judge didn't rule on law. He ruled on politics. For hours, Jasmine dissected the case with surgical precision. She reconstructed the entire timeline. ICE flagged individuals on March 3rd. DHS authorized transport by March 10th. And then on March 11th at 11:47 p.m. came the judge's order. Quiet, unannounced, and utterly final. Jasmine's voice dropped to a near whisper, as if the weight of the truth could crack the walls. "No questions asked. No one held accountable. And they expect us to call that justice?" She slammed the folder shut and stood tall. "We built this government on checks and balances, not backroom rulings from invisible men." That night, Jasmine didn't go home. She rehearsed for her interview like a lawyer prepping for trial. No teleprompters, no scripts, just conviction. When the studio lights turned on, she didn't blink. The host offered a diplomatic opener, hoping to keep things measured. Jasmine didn't bite. "Let me make something very clear," she said, steady as steel. "I am not attacking the courts. I am confronting the silence that protects them when they cross the line." The screen cut to a close-up. Her tone never wavered. "I respect the robe, but I reject the myth that it makes you untouchable." And then, the line that hit the nation like a thunderclap. "I'm not afraid of judges. I'm afraid of the ones no one dares to question. Power hidden under a black robe is still power. And if we don't check it, we're not a republic. We're a ritual." The studio went silent. Across the country, living rooms, diners, and late-night newsrooms lit up. Some called her reckless. Others called her righteous. But no one could ignore her anymore. The airwaves had barely cooled after Jasmine's televised interview when the tremors began online. Her words, cutting, clear, unapologetic, were already clipped into sound bites, overlaid with bold fonts and dramatic music. Her final line, "Power hidden under a black robe is still power," became a rallying cry for some and a declaration of war for others. Within hours, Twitter turned into a digital battlefield. On one side were Americans who had long felt unheard by the justice system. Blue-collar workers, retired servicemen, single mothers, small-town mayors, people who didn't quote constitutional clauses but knew what it felt like to lose in silence. They called her the last honest voice in Washington, the people's prosecutor, and even Lady Liberty with a briefcase. A sheriff from Texas posted a clip of her speech with one word, "Finally." A viral post from a former foster youth read, "She's not burning down the courthouse. She's showing us who locked the doors." Hashtags surged. Crockett courage. Judges aren't gods. Reclaim justice. Someone made t-shirts. A Navy veteran in South Carolina started a GoFundMe to put her speech on every billboard in America. TikTokers remixed her words with dramatic visuals of courtrooms, gavels, and prison gates closing. She didn't ask for a movement, but she got one, and it was growing fast. But for every cheer, there was a counterpunch. From the other side came an avalanche of accusations, editorials, and carefully crafted outrage. Legal scholars condemned her as a demagogue in a blazer, warning she was undermining the very foundation of judicial independence. A prominent D.C. law professor wrote, "What Crockett has done is open the door to mob rule, where judges will soon need approval ratings instead of legal precedent." Cable news panels lit up with headlines like, "Crockett's Crusade, Hero or Hazard." Conservative outlets accused her of weaponizing public ignorance. Liberal pundits called her a leftist version of populist overreach. It wasn't about what she said anymore. It was about what people feared her words could unleash. Inside courthouse walls, things turned icy. Federal judges who once greeted cameras with stone-faced indifference now closed their doors. Some released vague statements affirming commitment to impartiality. Others remained silent, watching her like a threat they couldn't publicly name. One anonymous judge told a reporter, "This is how institutions fracture, from the outside shouting into the chambers." Back in Jasmine's office, the tension was thick. Her staff was split, some thrilled by the momentum, others unnerved by the ferocity of the backlash. She listened, eyes locked on the screen as tweets flashed by. Supporters calling her brave, critics labeling her dangerous. An aide finally asked what everyone else was thinking. "Congresswoman, are you sure we haven't gone too far?" She didn't blink. "No," Jasmine said, her voice low and unshakable. "We haven't gone far enough." She walked to the window and looked out at the Capitol. Same marble, same flags, same illusion of permanence. But something had shifted, and she could feel it in her bones. People weren't just listening. They were waking up. And once that happened, no robe, no title, no institution could hide behind old symbols forever. 3 days after the media frenzy reached its peak, something shifted. Not through a speech, not through a protest, through a leak. It arrived quietly, like most tremors do before the quake. A heavily redacted government document, stamped with confidential internal review, landed in the inbox of a journalist from a mid-tier investigative blog. At first he thought it was fake, until 3 more reporters from different networks confirmed receiving the same file. Less than an hour later, it was posted in full, stripped of its black bars by someone with clearance and a conscience. And that was the moment the entire narrative around Judge Malcolm Pierce began to crack. Inside the file were the full, unfiltered profiles of the Venezuelan nationals who had been scheduled for deportation, the same group Judge Pierce had protected from removal with his late-night injunction. According to the leaked document, 12 out of the 23 individuals were flagged as security sensitive. These weren't casual notations. One had been arrested in Panama on charges of illegal weapons possession. Another had known associations with a transnational gang involved in narcotics trafficking. A third had biometric inconsistencies linked to a false identity used during a failed border crossing years earlier. These weren't undocumented dreamers. These were men with complicated records and, in some cases, dangerous ones. Yet the most damning part of the leak wasn't who they were. It was what wasn't done. The report confirmed that Judge Pierce had issued the emergency order without ever requesting access to the classified security briefings. He hadn't asked ICE for the full profiles. He hadn't summoned a hearing. There had been no opportunity for rebuttal, no independent review, no questions asked. Just a ruling. One man, one page, one decision. That decision had grounded a federal deportation flight and allowed more than a dozen questionable individuals to remain inside the United States. And now the country knew it. The reaction was immediate and electric. News outlets that had once framed Pierce as a symbol of moral resistance began walking back their praise. Did the judge act too soon? One CNN banner read. Oversight or overreach? Asked NPR. Even liberal-leaning commentators couldn't ignore the optics. The law isn't a shield for the well-intentioned, said one MSNBC analyst. If you're making decisions in the dark, you're not defending justice. You're guessing. The media didn't have to say Jasmine Crockett was right, because the facts were screaming it now. Social media turned into a firestorm of reassessment. People who had defended the judge began to hesitate. Users flooded the platforms with side-by-side images. One of Jasmine at her desk with a red pen, circling names on leaked documents. The other, a still of Judge Pierce walking calmly into a courthouse just a week before. The caption on one viral post read, "One of them asked questions, the other one didn't." Jasmine's office didn't issue a new statement right away. She didn't need to. The silence from her side said everything. She wasn't chasing headlines. She had chased the truth, and now it was staring the country in the face. But even so, not everyone welcomed the revelation. Some doubled down. High-profile law professors accused her of weaponizing intelligence leaks for political gain. A joint editorial from two retired federal judges warned that undermining judicial independence sets a dangerous precedent even when the facts are uncomfortable. Others argued that she had caused a chilling effect. Judges across the country reportedly began second-guessing whether to intervene in immigration cases, fearing political retaliation. Jasmine read all of it, every line, every loaded word, and she knew what they were really afraid of: accountability, public accountability. Behind closed doors, Jasmine met with her legal advisors and senior staff. The room was filled with tension, not celebration. One aide cautiously asked if this was the moment to call for Pierce's resignation. Jasmine shook her head. "No," she said, voice calm but firm. "This isn't about removing him. It's about removing the illusion that these decisions happen in a vacuum. Because they don't. They affect real people on both sides of the law." She paused, then added, "I don't want revenge. I want a reckoning." That night, Pierce's name trended again, but for a very different reason. Not as a martyr, not as a symbol of courage, but as a case study. A cautionary tale about what happens when unchecked authority meets incomplete information and zero resistance. One commentator on primetime news summed it up best. "He may have meant well, but he ruled blindly, and no robe should excuse that." And as the conversation evolved, a deeper question emerged. Not about Pierce, not even about Crockett, but about the system itself. How many decisions like this had already been made in silence? How many reports had never been read? How many orders had been signed without scrutiny, simply trusted because of the title behind the name? That was the question Jasmine had wanted the country to ask all along, and now finally they were asking it. The leak had changed everything. It shifted Jasmine from a voice in the wilderness to a woman standing in front of a burning building, pointing directly at the match. But while the public swirled in debate and reporters lined up outside Jasmine's office hoping for her next quote, another building, quieter, older, colder, was watching. Inside the towering white walls of the U.S. Supreme Court, the tension wasn't visible, but it could be felt in every hallway, in every quiet exchange between clerks and justices, in the careful way the court's public affairs director chose her words with the media. It had been years since the court was pulled into the public spotlight this directly, years since a sitting member of Congress had forced their hand. But now the silence was no longer dignified. It was conspicuous, and Chief Justice John Roberts knew it couldn't last. He didn't rush. That wasn't his style. Roberts was deliberate, surgical, a man who believed in the weight of words and the power of appearances. He read Jasmine Crockett's statements in full, not just the headlines, but the transcripts. He reviewed her voting record, her interviews, her past legal work. She wasn't reckless, he realized. She was precise. And that made her far more dangerous to the institution than a provocateur ever could be. Jasmine wasn't just criticizing a single judge. She was calling into question the entire ecosystem that allowed judicial decisions to go unquestioned, unchallenged, and too often unseen. So Roberts did what he had avoided for as long as possible. He prepared a response. The morning of the speech, he arrived early. Earlier than usual, even for him. The building was still. Security nodded silently as he entered the West Wing, where his private chambers sat in solemn quiet. In his hand, he carried a single sheet of paper, folded once down the center. It wasn't long, just 4 paragraphs, but he had rewritten it 6 times over the past 2 nights. Each word was weighed, each sentence trimmed of excess, emotion, or anything that could be mistaken for concession. He wasn't there to escalate, he was there to stabilize, to remind the public and Jasmine that the judiciary still stood apart, still above the fray. At 10:03 a.m., he stepped into the court's press room. No live cameras, no spontaneous questions, just a handful of pre-approved journalists and a single government videographer. Roberts approached the podium slowly, unfolded the paper, and began to speak. The courts of the United States do not make policy. That is the job of Congress and the executive. But neither do we allow our independence to be shaken by those who mistake disagreement for dysfunction. We do not fear questions, but we do not yield to performance. His voice was calm, steady, but cold. There was no mention of Jasmine Crockett, no direct reference to the leaked DHS report, but the message was unmistakable. Roberts wasn't just defending Judge Pierce, he was defending the robe itself. The rule of law, he continued, is not a matter of volume or headlines or trending topics. It is a matter of discipline, of process, of patience. And the day we forget that is the day we lose not just public confidence, but our own purpose. He finished the speech, folded the paper again, and stepped away without taking a single question. The room stayed still for a long beat, then exploded into a flurry of pens, keyboards, and flashes. By lunchtime, every major outlet had run the story. Roberts breaks silence amid judicial firestorm. Supreme Court chief subtly rebukes Crockett's campaign. Roberts defends judicial integrity. We do not yield to performance. Panel discussions were instant. Pundits parsed every syllable. Some applauded his restraint. Others called it hollow. Too little, too late, one political analyst said on live TV. He spoke of patience while the ground beneath the courts is shaking. A firestorm of op-eds followed. One conservative outlet hailed the speech as a return to form. A progressive columnist wrote, "He looked the American people in the eye and said nothing they hadn't already heard." And in federal courthouses across the country, the speech landed with a different kind of weight. It wasn't just noise, it was a warning, a line drawn in polished marble. And judges, many of whom had once dismissed Jasmine Crockett as an opportunist, began to feel the air shift. Some read the speech and nodded. Others read it and quietly panicked, because they knew what came next. This wasn't just about Judge Pierce anymore. This was about a system that had gone unchecked for too long, and a politician who had just proven the public was ready to check it. Group chats between magistrates filled with speculation. A district judge in Illinois emailed her clerk to audit the last 6 months of discretionary rulings. A magistrate in Arizona canceled 2 media interviews he'd previously agreed to, citing optics. One retired appellate judge even posted anonymously on a private legal forum. Roberts' speech wasn't a defense. It was a signal. He's telling us to tighten the ship before someone else does it for us. In some chambers, that meant circling the wagons. In others, it meant preparing for scrutiny. Either way, the robe no longer guaranteed invisibility. Back in her office, Jasmine sat at her desk, reviewing the text of Robert's speech. She read it once, then again. No emotion crossed her face. She didn't need a team to explain it to her. She understood exactly what he was saying. This wasn't a dialogue. It was a deflection, an attempt to reframe the issue as theater rather than substance. But Jasmine wasn't interested in theater. She was interested in truth. And truth wasn't offended by scrutiny. It demanded it. She placed the paper down, exhaled slowly, and turned to her senior aide. "They still think this is about one speech," she said. "It's not. It's about years of silence, years of assumptions, years of power no one dared to question." She rose, pulled a new folder from her briefcase, and opened it on the table. Inside, 3 more rulings from federal judges involving emergency orders, sealed proceedings, and procedural shortcuts that had never seen daylight. "We're not done," she said. "Not even close." The morning after Chief Justice Roberts' speech was supposed to calm the waters, it became clear that the storm hadn't passed. It had only moved, and Jasmine Crockett was standing directly in its path. She had stayed silent just long enough for the headlines to settle, just long enough for every editorial board and Sunday panel to ask, would she back down now that the highest court in the land had spoken? The answer came at 7 a.m. sharp, when her press secretary sent a single-line statement to every major outlet. Congresswoman Crockett will address the nation at 11 a.m. from the Capitol steps. Be on time. No one knew exactly what she was planning to say, but by 10:30 the air was already electric. Dozens of cameras were set up in rigid rows. Reporters paced in shallow loops, whispering predictions. Congressional staffers peeked from windows across the street. Even C-SPAN, usually last to the party, had gone live. And then, silence. Jasmine emerged from the front doors of the Capitol, not flanked by a security detail or a swarm of aides, but walking alone. She wore a dark navy suit, hair tied back, eyes locked forward. In her right hand, a manila folder thick with printed reports. In her left, nothing. No notes, no phone, no script. She stepped to the podium without hesitation, adjusted the mic once, and began. 3 men, all flagged by ICE, all linked to criminal networks, all nearly allowed to stay on U.S. soil, not because they were exonerated, but because one man in a black robe said so. The first sentence landed like a shot across the bow. Cameras clicked wildly. A few gasps escaped from the back of the crowd. Jasmine's tone didn't rise. It didn't need to. Her calm was sharper than anger. "Let me show you something," she continued. She reached into the folder and pulled out 3 documents, one by one, holding each up for the press to see. Each page had a photo, a summary, and a red warning box marked "Security Flagged." These are ICE risk assessments, not rumors, not anonymous tips. Government files reviewed by field officers. One of these men was arrested for arms trafficking in Caracas. Another had encrypted communications tied to a smuggling ring. The third entered the U.S. using a falsified identity. She paused just long enough for the weight of the information to settle. And still, they weren't deported because Judge Malcolm Pierce issued an emergency order without reviewing these documents. No hearing, no cross-check, no accountability. She placed the files down, slowly, precisely, and looked out over the sea of reporters. This isn't about one ruling, it's about a pattern, one where judges, unelected, unaccountable, can override national security protocols with the stroke of a pen. No vote, no review, no risk assessment. For a moment, the only sound was the wind pressing against boom mics. No one moved. Jasmine took a breath, then went further. "I want to be clear. This is not personal. I am not waging war on a single judge. I am confronting a structure that allows silence to carry more power than scrutiny. A structure where sealed courtrooms, midnight rulings, and judicial anonymity have replaced transparency." She reached back into the folder and pulled out another document. It was shorter, a single sheet of legislative language. She held it up. "Today I am introducing the Federal Judicial Oversight and Transparency Act. It will require independent review panels for all emergency immigration injunctions. It will mandate that national security reports be considered before any ruling halts a deportation. And it will force public disclosure of sealed emergency decisions, because secrecy does not equal safety." Gasps turned into buzz. Journalists began frantically texting producers and editors. Live captions struggled to keep up with her pace. She pressed on. "I am also formally calling on the House Judiciary Committee to open a bipartisan investigation into the use and abuse of emergency rulings in immigration cases over the past 5 years. We need to know, how often has this happened? How many times has one man, or one woman, overturned the will of elected agencies without oversight?" Now the tension in the air was more than political. It was constitutional. Jasmine was no longer just making a point. She was rewriting the rules. She stepped back from the mic for a second, then leaned in again. This time slower, quieter. "Let me say it plain. If you're making decisions that impact lives, safety, and national security, you don't get to hide behind your title. The robe is not armor. The courtroom is not a bunker. The public deserves to know what's being done in their name. And who's doing it? Then she stepped away. No questions. No handshake. No photo op smile. She walked off the stage the same way she'd arrived. Alone, confident, unshaken. Behind her, the wind caught the edges of the iced documents still resting on the podium. The camera crews zoomed in. One reporter whispered to another, "That wasn't a press conference. That was an indictment." And across the country, in federal courtrooms, chambers, and legal institutions that had long operated in comfortable silence, something shifted. The robe no longer guaranteed silence. The bench no longer guaranteed distance. Because Jasmine Crockett wasn't just questioning decisions, she was questioning the foundation they stood on. The press conference landed like a seismic tremor, not just in the media, but in the judiciary itself. By that afternoon, law clerks across the country were quietly instructed to double-check rulings. Courtroom calendars were cleared. Emergency orders were paused for procedural reevaluation. But one building felt the aftershock most: the federal courthouse in downtown D.C., where Judge Malcolm Pierce had ruled for over a decade. His office blinds stayed closed that day. His staff didn't return calls. There were no statements, no clarifications, no televised defense, only silence. And in Washington, silence means something is about to break. It came not in the form of a grand apology or dramatic resignation. It came as a 4-line press release, dropped late Friday evening when most reporters had closed their laptops. It read simply, "Judge Malcolm Pierce will be taking an indefinite leave of absence, effective immediately." This decision was made to avoid further disruption of the court's operations. All active cases will be reassigned. No further comment at this time. That was it. No admission, no explanation. Just a man stepping backward, hoping the shadows would swallow the fire he left behind. But the timing told the story. Less than 24 hours after Jasmine's press conference, less than a week after the leak, and only days after Roberts had tried and failed to steady the bench. Behind the scenes, the tension was palpable. Some judges saw Pierce's departure as necessary damage control. Others whispered that it was the beginning of something worse, a precedent, that if one federal judge could be forced into hiding by a single congresswoman and a stack of documents, then none of them were truly untouchable anymore. A district judge in Boston reportedly said to his clerk, she didn't need to unseat him, she only had to expose him. And in group chats, private forums, and long, careful email threads, a new emotion crept into the black and white halls of justice. Fear. Not fear of Jasmine, but fear of the public. Fear that the age of quiet rulings had ended, and the era of consequence had begun. Jasmine, for her part, didn't celebrate. She didn't tweet. She didn't smile for cameras. She simply walked into her office the next morning, closed the door behind her, and sat down. Her staff waited for some reaction, a nod, a sigh, anything. Instead, she opened her notebook and wrote a single sentence at the top of a blank page. The system blinked. Now what? Because she understood something no headline had captured. Pierce's leave wasn't a victory, it was proof. Proof that power will always retreat before it reforms. Proof that silence only ends when someone forces the room to listen. And above all, it was a signal that her work had just begun. The announcement of Judge Pierce's indefinite leave didn't end the tension. It unleashed it. His exit, understated and carefully worded, was never about remorse. It was a shield. One last move to absorb the blow Jasmine Crockett had delivered. But across the judiciary, the impact was immediate, visceral, and silent. Judges weren't talking to cameras. They were talking to each other, behind closed doors, in long, cautiously worded email chains and impromptu conference calls when no one outside those marble walls was supposed to know about. What had started as one woman holding up 3 iced documents had now triggered a quiet but profound reckoning inside America's most insulated branch of power. By Tuesday morning, judicial chambers in more than a dozen federal districts had blocked out hours of their calendars for internal protocol reviews. Some tried to keep it quiet, calling them staff development discussions. Others didn't bother hiding it. In the Southern District of New York, a senior judge called an emergency meeting with every magistrate in her building. Doors were locked, phones off. Inside, she laid it out without spin. "We need to audit our last 18 months of emergency rulings," she said. "I want eyes on every sealed order. If there's anything in there we wouldn't want on the front page, it shouldn't be there." No one argued. No one rolled their eyes. The message was clear. The era of quiet confidence was over. In Los Angeles, an internal email chain among immigration judges began circulating at 5:42 a.m. Subject line: "Pierce fallout. Are we exposed?" Attached were 5 PDF files: sample rulings, precedent memos, procedural guidelines. A judge in Houston shared a spreadsheet of every expedited injunction he'd signed since 2021, color-coded by level of public visibility. In Seattle, a district judge sent her clerk to reread the court's entire emergency docket going back 6 months. Her instruction was blunt: "If I missed anything, if I skipped a single verification or cut a procedural corner, I want it on my desk today." But the conversations weren't just about logistics. They were about fear, not of Jasmine herself, though her name was spoken in every meeting, but of what she had unleashed. She had shattered the illusion that the judiciary stood above scrutiny. And more importantly, she had shown the public where to look. One judge in Boston reportedly told his peers, "We've gone decades without the public caring about how we make these decisions. That's over. They're watching now. They have the receipts, and they have her." The room had gone silent after that, because it was true. Some judges tried to push back in subtle ways. A few drafted internal memos defending past rulings preemptively, preparing for the possibility of oversight hearings. Others tried to dismiss the moment as political theater, an overreaction. "This won't last," one magistrate in the Midwest muttered in a side conversation. "The news cycle will move on." But the nervous glances in the room told a different story. The news cycle might move on, but Jasmine wouldn't. And the public that had rallied behind her wasn't made of pundits. They were retired law enforcement officers, working-class parents, veterans, former defendants, people who finally felt like someone was speaking their language inside the walls of government. In Washington, the Administrative Office of the U.S. Courts, the nerve center of federal judicial policy, quietly began collecting internal reports from all circuits. Not for public release, not yet, but as a risk assessment. Behind the formal language and soft phrasing, the intent was unmistakable. Who else might be exposed next? One internal message to chief judges across multiple districts read, "Review all use of sealed emergency orders since 2020. Flag any with national security implications, immigration, or risk classification deviations." Translation: clean your house before someone else kicks the door in. Meanwhile, Jasmine Crockett stayed silent, at least in public. But her office was busy. Her team received anonymous tips from courthouse clerks, quietly pointing them toward cases that had been sealed with minimal justification. A retired judge even left a voicemail under a blocked number saying, "I wish someone had said what you're saying 20 years ago." Inside her inner circle, the atmosphere was tense, but focused. She wasn't celebrating. She was tracking, watching the system twist, tighten, self-audit, and expose itself. She turned to one of her senior aides late one night and said, "They're not afraid of Congress. They're not afraid of journalists. They're afraid of sunlight. And we just opened the blinds." The judiciary was no longer simply reacting. It was retreating. And in that retreat, the quiet turned strategic. Reports of internal reviews, judge-to-judge briefings, and back-channel legal memos continued to multiply, but none of it restored the public trust that had been cracked open on national television. Jasmine Crockett had changed the equation. This wasn't politics anymore. It was perception, it was legitimacy, and Chief Justice John Roberts knew that if something didn't change, and fast, the damage wouldn't just linger, it would spread. So, 1 week after Judge Pierce stepped away, Roberts made his move. No press releases, no public invitation, just encrypted emails and after-hours phone calls to select chief judges from key circuits: 2nd, 5th, 9th, D.C., and a handful of trusted voices from influential district courts. The location? a private judicial retreat center in Northern Virginia, usually reserved for ethics training in closed-door symposia. The purpose? Not reform, not yet, just containment, just control. At least that was the plan when they arrived. They gathered in a windowless meeting hall. 15 judges, each seated around a thick oak table beneath a chandelier that flickered with the weight of history. No transcripts, no recordings, only silence, guarded stares, and the knowledge that they were no longer invisible. Roberts entered last, a man visibly aged by the last 2 weeks. He didn't sit. He didn't greet. He walked to the head of the table and placed a single folder down in front of him. Then, without ceremony, he began to speak. "We are here because the robe is no longer enough, because one member of Congress and a few pages of truth have done more to rattle this institution than decades of legislation ever could." A long pause followed. No one interrupted. "And while we may disagree with her method, we can't ignore her message. Because if the public has lost faith in how we operate, then the failure doesn't rest with them. It rests with us." The words landed like a cold slap to the room. One judge shifted in his seat. Another folded his arms defensively. But no one objected, because deep down they knew. Roberts wasn't speaking as a leader trying to impress. He was speaking as a man trying to hold a line before it gave way completely. "We've allowed the culture of silence to become the standard. We've relied on tradition instead of transparency. We've used complexity as a shield instead of clarity as a bridge. And now that someone has called us out, we're reacting like we're under attack, when in fact, we're being asked a question we should have answered long ago." No one moved, no pens, no notes, just stillness. Then he delivered the line that would echo far beyond that room. "When the people lose trust in the courts, the problem is not the people. The problem is the courts." It wasn't an admission, it was a warning. The room shifted. Quiet murmurs rose. One judge from the Fifth Circuit pushed back gently, asking if Roberts was suggesting they open their processes to public review. Another asked whether this meant ceding control to Congress. Roberts didn't answer directly. He simply closed his folder and looked each of them in the eye. "I'm not asking you to surrender your judgment," he said. "I'm asking you to remember what gives it meaning in the first place. The people." And then, without waiting for debate, he turned and left the room. Behind him, 15 of the most powerful legal minds in the country sat surrounded by silence. Not imposed, but earned. The judges had their meeting. The Chief Justice had spoken. Memos were drafted, protocols reviewed, language rewritten. Behind closed doors, the system had begun moving. Not with purpose, but with pressure. But outside those chambers, on the steps of power where cameras clicked and microphones hovered like vultures, the story wasn't told in documents. It was told in presence. And on a bitter Thursday evening, Jasmine Crockett walked through it. Not to speak, not to argue, but to be seen. She exited the Capitol just after 6 p.m., the city bathed in winter gold. The press was already waiting. Not the circus of flashbulbs and shouting matches. Not today. Today they stood quiet. Hushed almost. 2 long rows of reporters, lenses lifted, not knowing what to expect. She didn't stop. She didn't wave. She didn't flash a smile for headlines. She walked directly between them, slow and steady, her heels clicking against the cold stone, like a metronome in a silent cathedral. The weight of the last 2 weeks hung on her shoulders, not in fatigue, but in conviction. This was no longer a battle. It had become something else, something deeper, something permanent. A voice from the crowd broke the silence, barely above a whisper. "Congresswoman, what now?" She didn't look back, because Jasmine Crockett understood something that few in that moment had fully grasped. She didn't need to answer the question. She had already become it. Later that evening, inside her office, the lights were off save for the golden glow of the city bleeding in through the tall windows. Washington at night was quiet, from the outside. But Jasmine's mind didn't rest. She stood by the window, arms crossed, her breath slow, steady. Below her, the Capitol lawn stretched out like a chessboard left mid-game. Across the plaza, spotlights illuminated the marble pillars of the Supreme Court. casting long shadows over the ground like silent ghosts of past rulings. She stared through the glass, not at the buildings, but at what they meant, at what they could still become. Behind her, aides moved quietly, unsure whether to interrupt. A legislative draft sat on her desk, highlighted, annotated, ready. Phone calls from state attorneys. General blinked unanswered. Committee requests were piling up. But in that moment, Jasmine didn't need noise. She needed clarity, and she found it, not in strategy, but in memory of why this all started. A sealed court order, a plane on the tarmac, 3 names on a risk assessment sheet, and one question no one had dared to ask out loud. Who holds the judges accountable? She hadn't called for resignations. She hadn't demanded impeachments. She hadn't chased power with power. What she did was simpler and far more dangerous. She had forced the courts to look at themselves and then asked the public to do the same. And now the system was blinking. Across the country, signs of change had begun to emerge. Subtle, cautious, but real. In Minneapolis, a federal court announced it would begin publicly publishing summaries of sealed emergency rulings. In Houston, a judicial review panel was formed. Quietly at first, but later confirmed by a local news outlet. In New York, judges agreed to start requiring independent risk audits before approving emergency immigration orders. These weren't revolutions. They were acknowledgments. Acknowledgments that something had been broken and someone had finally held up a mirror. And that someone was a woman from South Dallas with a law degree, a spine of steel, and a red pen she used like a scalpel. But none of it came without cost. Jasmine had been called every name in the book. Dangerous, grandstanding, naive, divisive. Anonymous threats arrived by mail. Senate colleagues she once called allies avoided eye contact in elevators. A columnist accused her of shaking the very foundation of judicial independence for personal gain. She read it once, then slid the article into a drawer already filled with similar clippings. She didn't react, because she knew what those attacks really were. Symptoms of discomfort, of power forced to justify itself for the first time in a very long time. And yet, for all the resistance, there were glimmers of alliance. A federal magistrate from Oregon sent her a handwritten letter. I don't agree with your tone, Ms. Reed, but I agree with your purpose. We've grown too comfortable. A retired appellate judge left a voicemail on her office line. You did something none of us ever had the nerve to do. You made the system feel its own weight. Even inside Congress, quiet support was forming. A coalition of freshman lawmakers had begun meeting weekly, asking the same questions Jasmine first raised. Questions like, why are emergency orders sealed by default? Why are judicial conduct reports buried in internal review panels? Why is independence confused with invisibility? Jasmine hadn't started a war. She'd started a conversation that couldn't be ignored. One of her aides entered the room quietly and set a folder on the windowsill beside her. Public interest request, he said softly. A high school in Pennsylvania. They want you to speak at their mock government summit. She smiled, just barely. We're on the syllabus now? He nodded. Apparently you're the Judicial Accountability Unit. She chuckled, just once, the sound low and tired. But it was real. As he stepped away, she finally turned back toward her desk. The room was dim. The city outside pulsed with headlights and soft sirens. She opened her notebook and wrote just one sentence at the top of a fresh page. A question that had haunted this journey since the beginning, but now rang with even more urgency than ever before. If the law doesn't protect justice, then who protects you? She underlined it twice, then leaned back in her chair, eyes fixed on the words. It wasn't rhetorical. It was a challenge, not just to judges, not just to lawmakers, but to the nation itself, and it would not go unanswered, not anymore. Thought for a couple of seconds, the city lights were still flickering across Jasmine's office window when the last committee message blinked onto her phone, and that soft digital glow becomes our handoff into the story's true endgame, the moment where fireworks settle into embers and meaning rises from smoke. In the silence that followed her storm, every threat scrawled in red ink, every headline calling her reckless, and every sideways glance in a marble hallway hardened into a single undeniable truth. Justice is not self-maintaining. It can be cornered, stalled, humiliated, or bribed into dormancy, but it never dies as long as a single voice is stubborn enough to keep asking why. Jasmine Crockett was that voice, surrounded by men in black robes, drowned out by centuries-old protocols, and ridiculed by pundits who confuse calm speech for credibility. Yet she kept talking, forcing the law to look at its own reflection. The backlash she faced was proof of concept. Power only swings when it feels a real blade against its armor. Anonymous letters arrived with threats more graphic than any courtroom charge sheet, but none of them cut deeper than the institutional indifference that tried to fold her courage into a footnote. That's the first human lesson. Resistance wears ordinary clothes, and injustice rarely calls itself by name. It hides in procedure, thrives on fatigue, and survives on collective shrugs, until one person decides that silence is heavier than confrontation. In the ledger of public life, Jasmine paid the cost up front so the nation could collect the interest later. The second lesson burns with slower heat, unfolding in the quiet space between her press conference and Judge Pierce's retreat into indefinite leave. Authority is not evil, but it is never holy. A black robe can signal brilliance and discipline, yet it can also mask shortcuts, blind spots, and well-intentioned arrogance that turns parchment principles into paper shields. Pierce's downfall wasn't scripted by villains. It emerged from an ecosystem that prized speed over scrutiny and tradition over transparency. When a single unsigned order grounded an entire deportation flight, millions finally saw how thin the membrane was between civic myth and operational reality. That thinness matters because every unchecked decision, whether stamped, classified, or whispered in a marble corridor, writes a secret line in someone else's biography. A border agent second-guessing protocol, a family waiting for closure, a community wondering why the rules change in the dark. Jasmine's greatest act wasn't exposing one judge. It was forcing the system to document its own heartbeat in ink the public could read. She proved that reverence without review calcifies into ritual, and ritual without reflection breeds quiet catastrophe. In pushing the courts to audit themselves, she reminded the country that accountability is the most patriotic act a public servant can perform. Only by making the invisible visible can institutions remember why they were ever worthy of trust. Third comes the lesson etched in the sudden hush after Chief Justice Roberts' secret summit. Reform is born in discomfort, raised in conflict, and tested in daylight. When Roberts finally admitted, if people lose faith in the courts, the problem is the courts, he wasn't surrendering. He was translating Jasmine's accusation into judicial vernacular. His words carried an indictment more piercing than any op-ed. Prestige means nothing if perception rots beneath it. The judges who sat around that oak table learned a hard arithmetic. Public confidence equals authority multiplied by transparency. Subtract either, and the product implodes. Their hurried self-audits weren't merely bureaucratic exercises. They were survival instincts belatedly kicking in. Jasmine didn't have to write their resignations. She wrote the suspense that cornered their complacency, and suspense is the most honest mirror power ever meets. The fact that robes rustled in fear proves systems can evolve when forced to breathe the same air as the people they govern. That oxygen is uncomfortable, but democracy was never designed for comfort. It was forged for course correction. A gavel only rings true when struck against the anvil of public insight. Fourth, courage is rarely loud for long because the work begins after the applause. Jasmine walked past those reporters without a word because speeches had done their job. Now paperwork, policy drafts, and late-night coalition calls had to finish it. She understood that victory laps waste momentum and invite revisionist spin. Instead, she opted for presence over proclamation, turning silence into narrative tension the cameras couldn't ignore. That choice teaches us that heroism is less about volume and more about stamina, the willingness to trade instant vindication for systematic change. Her restraint mocked every critic who claimed she was chasing headlines. Real headline hunters never leave the microphone. By stepping away, she converted media frenzy into legislative oxygen, giving skeptical lawmakers space to study, absorb, and finally adopt pieces of her transparency agenda. The lesson sticks. Sometimes the most powerful sentence is the one you decide not to say on camera, so it can echo in the rooms where laws are actually written. Measured silence can weaponize curiosity, and curiosity, once awakened, rarely goes back to sleep. Fifth, the story proves that individual resolve can destabilize institutional inertia, but only collective vigilance can rebuild trust. After Jasmine's crusade, small reforms sprouted: public summaries of sealed orders, independent risk panels, mandatory audit trails. Skeptics called them cosmetic, yet even cosmetic cracks widen under civic pressure. Each change engraved a precedent that future activists can point to. If it moved once, it can move again. That's how systems evolve, from jolts to increments, from increments to norms. The injustice Jasmine faced, smears, threats, procedural stonewalls, illustrates the emotional tariff every reformer pays. But it also shows the dividend, a nation's legal backbone bending a millimeter closer toward daylight. Progress may feel glacial, yet glaciers reshape continents given enough force and time. The public learned that oversight is not a sign of distrust. It's a declaration that the governed are awake. In democracies, insomnia beats complacency every election cycle. Sixth, outrage without blueprint is just noise. But blueprint without outrage collects dust. Jasmine married both. She weaponized public disbelief, then handed Congress a legislative map. That synthesis is the template for future battles over opaque power. Expose, propose, insist. It is easier to attack personalities. It is harder and nobler to overhaul procedures. She chose the harder path, absorbing personal blows so structural beams could be realigned. The unfairness she endured, mocked for ambition, accused of undermining patriots, framed as reckless, demonstrates how status quo defends itself by pathologizing dissent. Yet her steady campaign proved that fair process is not anti-institutional, it is pro-institution. She reminded America that honoring a system means demanding its best days outnumber its easy days. Anything less betrays the parchment we claim to revere. Seventh, transparency is not about spectacle, it is about stewardship. When those ICE documents appeared under studio lights, Jasmine didn't revel in gotcha theatrics. She treated them like exhibits in the court of public opinion, handled, read aloud, contextualized. That precision gave the story weight that rumor cannot carry. Information, when curated with discipline, turns spectators into stakeholders. Once the public saw the evidence, the conversation shifted from sentiment to standard. Should sealed emergency orders be shielded from independent review? Should risk profiles be optional? Those questions outlived the news cycle, embedding themselves in committee briefings and law school syllabi. Justice that hides breeds suspicion. Justice that teaches breeds resilience. The story's message is simple. When truth walks through the front door, power scrambles to reorganize rather than retreat. Eighth, every citizen now owns a fragment of the outcome. The reforms inching through committee halls, the judges drafting clearer opinions, the law students studying this saga in real time. None of it would exist without the public energy Jasmine catalyzed. That energy carries a warning as urgent as her red-line documents. Vigilance cannot be outsourced. The courts, the police, the legislature, each holds authority only in proportion to the scrutiny it endures. If the people fall asleep again, the old shadows will lengthen. Jasmine's journey shows how quickly a single sealed order can erase months of democratic labor, and how equally fast-determined oversight can resurrect accountability. Democracy, then, is a contract renewed daily, written in ink but signed in attention. Neglect voids the warranty, vigilance repairs the cracks. Ninth and finally, the human heart of the lesson crystallizes in Jasmine's handwritten question. If the law doesn't protect justice, who protects you? It's more than rhetoric. It's a siren for every viewer who felt a chill as she walked silently between rows of cameras. The answer is both daunting and empowering. We do. We, the audience, the voters, the jurors, the readers, the quiet whistleblowers, the restless veterans, the anxious parents, the skeptical reporters. Justice is a chain whose strength depends on the least celebrated link. The unfairness Jasmine faced echoes the unfairness countless citizens meet when institutions close ranks. But her victory, partial yet potent, proves the chain can hold if even one link refuses to snap. In that refusal lies the ultimate takeaway. Laws are words, judges are people, and power is only sacred when it serves something larger than itself. The next time a sealed order threatens daylight, remember this story, and remember that silence is not safety, it is surrender. So let the image linger. Jasmine Crockett at her window, city lights bleeding gold across her determined face, no speech on her lips, only a question bright enough to outshine marble. That's the final beat, the human music under the legal thunder. Justice may travel through statutes, courthouses, and titles, but it breathes only when ordinary people keep watch. The story closes not with a gavel, but with a pulse, urging every listener to ask themselves one thing each morning. What am I doing today to keep the law honest? Because if we don't, someone like Jasmine will have to, and she has already paid enough for all of us. And now the story leaves her hands and lands in yours. Because what began with a sealed order and a grounded deportation flight didn't end in Jasmine Crockett's office or behind a courthouse door. It ends here, with you, with your silence or your voice, your doubt or your demand. She fought the system not to claim a title, but to reveal the truth, that justice is only real if someone makes sure it doesn't get lazy. She took the heat, carried the threats, was called everything from dangerous to naive, not because she was reckless, but because she refused to whisper what needed to be shouted. And now that the shouting has died down, the question lingers like a spark in dry grass. What are you going to do about it? Because the battle isn't over. Far from it. The emergency orders are still being filed. The sealed rulings are still sealed. The black robes still carry the benefit of the doubt. Sometimes deserved, sometimes not. Jasmine lit the torch, but one torch doesn't clear a forest. If you felt something when she raised those documents to the cameras, if you leaned forward when she said, "No robe should protect bad judgment," then you've already been recruited into the next chapter. This isn't a movie, it's not over, and watching is no longer enough. Ask your representatives what oversight exists for judicial discretion. Push for transparency in emergency rulings. Demand public logs of sealed orders. Because if the system fears daylight, that's exactly where we need to shine. You don't need a law degree to defend fairness. You don't need a podium or a camera to ask the hard questions. All it takes is refusing to look away when something doesn't feel right. The same way Jasmine didn't look away when that deportation flight was halted. The same way she didn't sit still when a judge's decision bypassed due process. She saw a breach in the wall and ran toward it. You can too, at your city council, your local courthouse, your next election. Look up your judges, read the rulings, show up where it's uncomfortable, because the moment we stop paying attention, the silence comes back. And silence protects the powerful more than any law ever could. There is no cavalry coming. That's the truth Jasmine learned in the halls of power. No one is going to fix it for us, not unless we push, not unless we raise our hands, raise our voices, raise the standards of the people we let speak on our behalf. A republic is not a spectator sport. It's not a courtroom drama you stream between dinner and sleep. It is a contract. And every day you ignore the fine print, someone else rewrites it without you. Jasmine showed what happens when just one person reads the fine print out loud and refuses to pretend it says something it doesn't. So if you're waiting for permission to care, this is it. If you're wondering whether it's too late, it's not. But if we wait much longer, the damage won't be symbolic. It'll be written into law, because power, unchecked, rewrites rules in permanent ink. Jasmine fought to put a question mark where they wanted to carve a period. Now the ink is still wet, and it's our move. Call your representatives. Write your local court administrator. Ask how many emergency orders are sealed without review. Demand a database. Push for public oversight. Support legislation that brings transparency to judicial discretion. Share Jasmine's story. Talk about it at the dinner table, in your school, at work, online. Turn passive awareness into public pressure. Because the only thing more dangerous than a broken system is a quiet public willing to tolerate it. And finally, if you ever doubt whether one voice can crack stone, remember this. Jasmine Crockett didn't tear down the system. She made it look at itself, and that alone was enough to make it flinch. So now it's your turn. Make it flinch again. Thank you for watching until this moment and for standing with us on this journey for justice. Your support means everything. Like, subscribe, and turn on notifications so you never miss what's next. And we'd love to hear your thoughts. Leave a comment below and let us know what moved you most in this story. Together, our voices make a difference.